Conscient Podcast, episode 173. Choreographer, performer, facilitator, consultant, and craniosacral therapist, Kelly McInnes.
I think there's a lot of focus on systems change, and we need all of that, but what we really need is to change ourselves so that we can actually embody the world that we want to be in, and so that has a big piece of healing and how art can be a part of that.
I first heard about Kelly McInnes' work from Kim Richards, who was my guest on both episode 76 and episode 171. And I had a very interesting conversation with Kelly in her kitchen on May 10th, 2024 in Vancouver. Kelly is a queer dance artist concerned with embodying care and creating as a way of remembering connection to Earth. Her craniosacral therapy practice and her passion for collective healing powerfully inspires her artistry, and I have to say, it inspired me as well. For example, here's how Kelly describes her creative process.
The part that excites me about community engagement too is that creative practice feels like a way into like a life process. And so not just sharing like the product with folks, but actually inviting them into.
I was struck by the simplicity and depth of her work, in particular her latest project, Late Stage Remedy, which she describes as a collective dance meditation practice happening twice a month on Saturdays from May to September 2024 at public parks in so-called Vancouver, where an improvised score performed by a group of dancers offer grounding presence, attention, and care to the lands they dance on together. The work is an invitation to remember ourselves as part of Earth and honor this vital, potent connection. Kelly and I also talked about the connections between her art practice and her healing work.
And I think that as just a practice of life is so important in these times where there's so much to be, heartbroken about, and there's so much devastation going on.
This is the second in my community art series in season 5 of the Conscient Podcast. The first was episode 168, Felicia Young. There will be more soon. Here's our conversation.
Hello, Kelly.
Hello.
Well, we just met like literally a few minutes ago, which I was saying is not the usual way I usually work, but a friend, in fact, somebody I recorded yesterday, Kim Richards, mentioned your work, and I saw what you're doing with this community arts project right now here in Vancouver, so I was curious to know more about it, but also I'm doing a series of conversations about community-engaged arts with artists wherever I can, and I'm interested in the practices of collaborative community-based. I've always been interested in that. I find there's really good energy there in terms of the process. But let's start at the beginning. Who are you? What's your background? And so that people know a little bit about you.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. My name is Kelly McInnes, and Well, yeah, going back, my ancestry is Irish, Scottish, and British. On my dad's side, Irish, and they settled on the East Coast. And my dad found his way to BC. And then on my mom's side, she's British, and she came over to Canada as an adult with her family. And I was born and raised up north in BC on Tsimshian territory, and I grew up outside of town in the middle of the forest. And this feels like something that has been deeply impactful on who I am and how I exist. And I've always felt a lot of resourcing from the earth, and so that's something that continues to stay with me. When I was 18, I moved to Vancouver, so I've been living here on Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh territory for about 15 years, and I did professional dance training program here called Modus Operandi, and then found other avenues of dance and somatics that felt, it feels like my dance history has been equally traumatizing and then also healing, and so I've been moving towards that as like the beginning of my healing journey. I reflect back now, and yeah, so I work as a choreographer, performer, and community facilitator, and a lot of my projects feel like sort of my way of trying to remember that connection to land and inviting others into that with me. And in 2019, I started craniosacral therapy school and have been certified for a few years now. And so that's been a huge transformation in me personally, and then also how I want to offer, like the things that I want to offer to the world.
Well, the fact that you trained in dance is interesting for me because I've been doing work with Shannon Litzenberger in Toronto and somatic exercises and body dance, and that's quite new to me, but it just shows it's never too late.
I love that.
to participate, to make yourself vulnerable through movement, and to learn to, not pay attention to your thoughts as much as the other intelligences in the body. It's a bit of a trend now, but I'm happy that it's a trend because we really need it, for our healing. And so maybe start with this project you're doing now, the one that's literally in progress. What are your intentions and how does it relate in one way or another to the end of the world as we know it?
Yeah, so my project is called Late Stage Remedy. It's a collective dance meditation that happens in different parks around the city. And I started it last year, and we've just begun another season this year. And it invites all folks of different levels of ability and experience with dance or meditation to join. And yeah, the kind of beginnings of the project for me was, how can I bring the work that I'm doing in art and dance and take the kind of concepts of my craniosacral practice and what I'm learning about healing and what I'm learning about trauma and create some kind of experience that could I guess be an offering of what I see is needed in the world. And so one of those things is, in order to meet the big collective trauma that we're existing in right now in this world, is that we need to be able to be resourced enough and to have community to be able to start to touch into those places, because I really feel and have been learning how we, I think there's a lot of focus on systems change, and we need all of that. But what we really need is to change ourselves so that we can actually embody the world that we want to be in. And so that has a big piece of healing and how art can be a part of that. And so, yeah, Late Stage Remedy, it's an offering to come to the park, to spend an hour connecting and being present with the land. And then also there's time around it to feel that belonging and community. Yeah.
I guess it's one of those things that, and of course, people in Vancouver are invited to participate, I assume, right?
Yes, definitely. Last year was sort of my beginning, like, oh, this is kind of like a trial. So I invited folks that were community participants that I already knew and their friends, and then some professional artists that I have relationships with or wanted to build relationships with. But this season, like, it was just such a success last year that this season I've extended the invitation more broadly to whoever feels called to join.
Well, I couldn't make it for the one session, but I wonder how you think this work might, you talked about healing and transformation. Well, I don't know if you said transformation, but what kind of effect might this have on participants, and how might they use that for not just, I guess, healing themselves, but being more active in facing the challenges that we have in front of us?
I think, the score part of it is slowing down, sharing our presence and love with the earth, simplicity, or having satisfaction in less. Inside of this score and this practice, we can sort of attune like our sensitivity. I think that's something, especially as embodied artists, we have to offer people, is that there's like a knowing that can be, that's like not connected to our brains, and there's a lot of valuing of knowledge in a certain way in our society, but we have so much intelligence in our bodies, and our bodies are the land. So there's also a remembering of ourselves as part of the land. And I think in doing that, I noticed last season a lot of wisdom that came from just being in the practice of doing that. And I guess my hope is, and I feel that in myself, that it kind of, it's like a push or like a support to be practicing in my daily life how I want to exist, how I want to be in relation with the land, with community, and those kinds of things.
I guess art is kind of a conduit towards that.
I think so. I think, I in the last few projects, I often in my little descriptions is like, this is a prayer, it's medicine, it's a meditation, it's a ritual. And so, yeah, just kind of like seeing art as all of that, and how it, I think a big part of it, and this is like, I think the part that excites me about community engagement too, is that creative practice feels like a way into like a life process. And so not just sharing like the product with folks, but actually inviting them into like a birthing. That's what we do as artists. We birth things that come to us through channels that we, we're like opening and allowing intuition and trust. And in the ways that being with the land brings that kind of wisdom, I think that as artists, we also, often are practicing being sensitive and listening. And so we can offer that sort of a practice to other folks, because I think sometimes it feels like it can almost like I feel I can almost take that for granted, but it's so not the reality of many people in the world, is they don't have the opportunity to practice that.
And it's all about those interconnections. We're speaking in your kitchen here, and earlier there were some really nice gurgly sounds of water passing in it. I was listening to you, but I was also kind of feeling the water and thinking, where is it coming from? Where is it going? And I think we develop sensitivities, des sensibilités en français, that we that help us make sense of the world more so. Like, one of my guests recently was talking about privilege, and at the end he talked about context. And so context is where do things come from, like where, and because we live in this sort of abstraction that there's endless growth and things just appear, in the store and all that fallacy. And when we connect with them, be it through an art practice or through meditation or whatever you want to call it, the world changes. Because then you touch a piece of wood and you realize it's a tree. It might still be alive, depending on how you think about it or feel it. And so that's why I think art of all kinds, it brings you into some level of awareness or connection. But when people get together through a process of either co-creation or just a togetherness, outside of the walls of the structures of. I mean, it doesn't. Community arts can happen indoors as well, but there's something about just breaking it down to the most basic element, that we're together and we're going to do something today. And we might or might not talk about it, but so what has been your experience, and what advice do you have to other artists doing this kind of work? I know it's not easy because you have a lot of logistics. I mean, you're constantly coordinating people and things fall apart and you build them again. But what's it like to do this practice, and what are some of the, not best practices, but some of the things that you found to be more successful, or to really engage people in a process?
What you said about the relationships, like it really is about the relationships. I want to do this thing, but I also, like, a big part of it for me too was during the pandemic, feeling this isolation and just noticing how much I was hearing that people were suffering and feeling disconnected. So it's like, in any way that people can show up and just have that space to be together, and within the community agreements that we've established that create care and safety, or safer space for people, that it just creates a space for vulnerability and for belonging, and that we don't have to show up in any way other than how we are in the present moment. I think that's been a big part of it. And I think in the past and other projects, sometimes with this kind of trajectory of like, make it, show it, there's like a lot of stress that can be involved in that. And,
write a final report about it. Get another one.
And one of the things with this project was like, I wanted it to happen over a long period of time. So it starts in the spring and goes until the fall. And this year we're meeting twice a month, so that we could really be touching into, a longer trajectory of relationship building and hearing about how people are doing. I think a part of it is like, we do the practice, but another big part of it is that we do a check-in and a check-out, which is a time for us to be listening and kind of already starting the practice. Like, how can we listen without judgment and with openness to one another, as if we were attending to the land. And so I think being able to be seen and heard in that way is really impactful for people. And I've noticed that there's been a lot of sharings around people feeling very nourished and grounded and connected to one another. And so that feels really special.
Well, on your website, I saw a number of examples of at Trout Lake and other places where you would be there as a performer. And I'm just trying to visualize, how would you describe, like, when somebody arrives, do they wear gear? I mean, do they wear costumes, or what happens?
No, it's very simple.
Right.
Just sort of show up in comfy clothes. And yeah, there's no music or anything. I made little cards that have the score on them just to remind them, and we do a group warm up and then small group check-ins, and then we just have someone on the outside that's kind of holding space and timing us. They ring a bell to start and end the practice, and then we just do a little checkout. And yeah, that's kind of how it goes. And last year did it at a different park each time, and this year I'm excited to return. Like, in one way, I think it would be amazing to just do the same park all the time, because there's also that like relationship building with that place. But I've decided, just for, doing it in different areas, that we'll do parks at least twice, the same park, the same location at least twice this year.
Well, as you were speaking, there was an episode I recorded this week in Vancouver. I think it was 170, with a group of researchers in acoustic ecology, and Hildegard Westerkamp was part of the group, and Milena Drumeva, and we were talking about sound walking, and it's very common here in Vancouver. Not common. There's a tradition of doing sound walking, and it sounds a bit like that, something very simple and yet very profound, because the slowing down in and of itself is an act of resistance.
Yes.
The pandemic's starting to fade now a little bit in my mind, but I do remember being alone and trying to tune into art projects online, and how sometimes it was wonderful and sometimes it was weirder than being by myself, but here we are now in a hybrid world where we can do both. We can do online things, and I do quite a bit of online conversations with people in different parts of the world, and that's pretty wonderful to have that dialogue. But I mentioned yesterday that I started an art and ecology potluck at my house, our house, to get people together to talk about what they're doing in and around art and ecology, any art form, whatever, and around food as well, local food production. And so that's why your project caught my interest, because I wish there were more. I know there are more, but I think there could be even more. Art projects that are very simple. I think it's simple conceptually. I'm sure you've thought about it for many years and you have training and all that, but just something that's, and it already happens in a way when people co-garden, or when they, you can go to church or whatever it is, the community activities. Art is in there, but art somehow can lift spirits. Sometimes it can make you very sad as well, to feel the sorrow, the pain, the grief.
I'll just touch on what you just said
Sure.
about, because I was also thinking this, it can be such a beautifully nourishing practice, and also it creates the space for that grief to come up, In doing this practice to connect with the land, we also notice how much disconnect there is, and how much that isn't familiar to us, and, how much we potentially don't know how to do it. And so I think there is a big piece there.
We're in our phones, faces are in our phones.
And I didn't say this at the beginning, but I've been extremely grateful and privileged to have had the opportunity to work with Indigenous artists over the last 6 years or so, and meet a lot of amazing people who've taught me so much. And a lot of this how this project came about is also from that learning about our connection to the land, where my ancestors came from, and how far back they were embedded in the land, and how that knowledge has been lost for me. And so also that's like a part of the project for me, is how can I start to deepen those roots again. Yeah, I think also that unlearning piece, I also like to think about it as it's like remembering, because, there is somewhere back, especially as settlers, that our ancestors were indigenous to a land and they were embedded in the land and they did have the knowledge of reciprocal relation. And so, that energy, that ancestral field is still with us. And that's part of the healing work, is, I think, for me, being able to touch those wounds and integrate that, because there's learning inside of it for us.
Yet we're both, white settlers.
Mm-hmm.
There's always that delicate, but it sounds like you've been collaborating and listening and developing trusting relations with all kinds of people, and that's a good way to work, as opposed to jumping in there and saying, I'm going to produce a show and I need this and I'm going to further extract,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Anyway, Kelly, it's I did ask that question about future because I'm noticing that you're a young person and you surely aspire to do other things. And so I mean, it partially it's that. I mean, we always have new projects, but how do you see the future directions of your art and the arts? What can the arts do further to address some of the challenges we face?
Yeah, I think this piece we've been talking about community engagement is really big for me. As a performer, used to more make work for where it's like an audience is attending and witnessing, but I'm more interested in how that can be more of a collaborative or just an interchange than just those moments. And so, I'm imagining workshops and thinking about how my creations can include that kind of, just dialogue and bringing of community into the process. But it definitely does feel like a question mark for me in this moment. I think late stage remedy has been a big shift for me. And yeah, kind of, I'm still in this place of maybe letting go of ways that I was working before, and then trying to sort of lay the seeds for what could be new. But I do feel like art has this special place of supporting people to connect to something deeper in themselves and do that kind of embodied work. And also there's a titration of, being able to speak truth of the injustices and the ways that things need to change, but also being able to envision and practice how we want to be in our bodies and in relations. And my cranio practice, there's this really big emphasis on listening to the health. And I think that as just a practice of life is so important in these times where there's so much to be, heartbroken about, and there's so much devastation going on, that there's also a health response. Like trauma is a health response and numbing is a health response, but also, these practices of resourcing ourselves and finding beauty and finding resonance, like they're actually so important and essential to being able to imagine and create these worlds we want to move towards. And so, yeah, how can we, or that's a question that I'm asking, like, how can I find the health in difficult places, or in discomfort? And in these like really challenging times that are asking us to change so much. Like birth, it's like can be such a violent process to go through, but it's also amazing life unfolding, you know.
I hadn't thought of it that way, of signs of health. We talked about numbing in the last few days with Kim, actually. And we're like putting words onto things that we're experiencing, but we don't know what to call it. You know, grief, we understand that, but numbing, yeah, and becoming unnumbing.
I like to call it melting.
Melting, right. So interesting.
Yeah. The numbing, I think, is a health response because we're living in such overwhelming times, and even though we have so much information about trauma and healing, we're not living in a trauma-informed society at this point. And I think a big piece that art and like what I see is in my practice as an artist that I can do, you know, in craniosacral, it is this one-on-one thing, but in my art practice, in my practice as a facilitator, I can bring groups of people together. And in order to be able to meet these huge things like the climate crisis or decolonization, like, you know, we just can't do it like in our nervous systems on our own. And so being able to practice together how to hold spaces and to grow our kind of container of that energy so that we can do that unnumbing work in a safe way.
And so, do you have any reading or listening recommendations? Things that you're.
Yesterday, I saw the film Yinta,
Oh, yeah.
which is the Wet'suwet'en land defenders in northern BC, and their decade-long resistance against the CGL pipeline, and their journey of occupying their territory and defending the land. It was so inspiring and moving, and just, you know, I think everyone should see that film. It felt for me like such a, like they're just so brave. They're just so brave, and what they're defending is so important. It's like the most important thing. And sometimes, you know, I think for myself, like there's all, you know, these other things that get in the way, but just seeing that film, it's like, this is where I want to be putting my energy, and, you know, how can I create my life in a way that I can do that and be brave like that. Yeah. And like, they're just showing that for us. Yeah. Really.
I'll put the link to the film in the episode notes.
Also, The Point of Relation is a podcast by Thomas Hubel, and I've been studying with him for a few years. He does a lot of work around collective healing. And so, yeah, that's where I've gotten a lot of the sort of ideas about where I want to be moving and what I want to be focusing on from him. So he's an amazing teacher, and also I feel like he can articulate concepts that feel very complex in simple terms. So that's like, yes, what we need. And then this book called We Are the Middle of Forever, Indigenous Voices from Turtle Island on the Changing Earth. And it's all these interviews with Indigenous land defenders and elders about, how they see moving forward in the world that we're in right now. So it's amazing. Also, I think everyone should read that book.
Well, in the interview yesterday, I was telling Kim, who recommended that we speak, and I'm very glad that we did. Thank you, Kelly. I was saying at the end of some interviews, the interviewer goes, "Well, Kelly, thank you very much." And I just love doing that. I don't know why. And it's like, thank you very much. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure.